Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking time out of your busy Tuesday afternoon to attend part 2 of our two-part training on the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act. I hope you all are staying healthy, staying safe, and enjoying time with your friends and family and loved ones, as virtually or over the phone or in person, depending on your situation. Okay, so today, the last time we talked about basically what the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act is and why it's important. And today we're going to talk about some of the foundational court cases that have kind of established how the statute and its implementing regulations are are carried out in real life. And so today the presentation will be recorded. It will be on our website. Questions are welcome anytime using your raise your hand feature. And please mute your microphone unless you are asking a question. We'll also keep an eye on the chat function, so if you want to type your question in, please do so. But it would probably be easier if you just unmuted yourself temporarily and stopped me to ask the question. And then also for those of you who do not know me, my name is Danny Lapin. I am the environmental planner with the Otsego County Conservation Association. Great to meet you virtually. And today we have 3 objectives, or actually 4 objectives in, 4 objectives in our SEQRA review process. The first is obviously to have fun. I know SEQRA can be dry, but if used correctly, SEQRA could be your most powerful tool in your environmental arsenal. The next objective of our presentation is to understand the role of the courts in the SEQRA review process. And finally, kind of want to be able to understand how some of the most important cases were decided and how they impacted the future trajectory of how SEQRA is applied locally and all throughout the state as well. And so today, kind of building on that, here's our outline. We're first going to talk about kind of what the role of the courts are in the SEQRA review process and what the role of the public is in the SEQRA review process. And it's important to pay attention to these 2 players because one kind of builds off the other. The public usually will bring what is known as a challenge to a final decision made by like a planning board, a state agency, a regional planning agency. And they'll say, hey, we're not sure how this provision of SEQRA is supposed to work, or we think something was done incorrectly. The courts, their role is to basically decide who's right and who's wrong, and how the statute and the implementing regulations are interpreted. And so all that kind of leads to our foundational court cases. These kind of lay the basic groundwork that those of you looking to be introduced to the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act will most likely come across or most likely hear or see cited in legal opinions. And finally, we'll have some time for questions if you are interested. And so who am I? As I said before, I'm the environmental planner with the Otsego County Conservation Association. I am a nationally certified planner by the American Planning Association. And I was hired in 2014 by OCCA, fresh out of graduate school from Bard College, where I received my master's in environmental policy. And I studied before that at the University of California, Riverside, where I majored in environmental science. And so who I'm not the secret police. I'm not here to tell you that my opinion is the almighty 100% correct set in stone opinion. I'm just merely trying to provide some insight into the statute and its regulations. That said, if you're looking for solid advice, I recommend always consulting an attorney when seeking legal advice related to SEQRA. And so what is OCCA? We are a 501c3 nonprofit environmental organization located in the town of Springfield, about 7 3/4 miles north of the village of Cooperstown's boundaries, or right on the shore of Otsego Lake. We have 3 full-time staff currently and 4 part-time staff. And we have 3 main program areas: education and outreach. Think your nature walks, your hikes, your school-based events, research and monitoring. Think about citizen science, water quality sampling, invasive species monitoring removal, and research on renewable energy and climate change. And finally, the area that we're discussing today, policy and planning. This is the area that I cover and most enjoy. I run a program called the Circuit Rider Planner Program, which we'll touch on later. And my job is to keep abreast of state, local, and federal environmental policy changes and analyze them and interpret them on how they would affect our county and its 60,000 residents. And so this is a visual representation of what we do. We do everything from kid-based events such as tree identification events. You can see our program director, Jeff O'Hanley, on the left side, educating some children about tree identification. And then you can see us in the halls of Congress with our New York 19 Representative Antonio Delgado. And then from there, you can kind of see our research activities. There's on the far right, there's one of our former interns, Mary, who was helping with the collection of water chestnuts. And then right in the middle, there's a group of student volunteers collecting water quality samples. So we do a lot of different things, all of which kind of tie into SEQRA environmental policy directly and indirectly as well. And so, again, just to recap, the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act is basically the statute which governs the way in which local governments enact or conduct planning, development, and permit issuance processes all throughout the state. The statutes in the New York State Environmental Conservation Law and its implementing regulations are Section 617 of the New York Code of Rules and Regulations. And so, this wasn't just invented in New York. This was derived from the National Environmental Policy Protection Act, or NEPA for short. SEQRA was enacted in 1975, and its purpose is to encourage harmonious development or harmonious connection between humanity and its environment. Or more specifically, it's intended to balance economic growth and environmental protection. And so, from part one is on YouTube. If you have not seen it, I recommend you touch on it. But we'll review briefly. Last time we went over what is SEQRA. We went over what is an action, so what would trigger the SEQRA review process to start, how to make a SEQRA determination if you are a member of a town board or planning board and you have to make a decision, or if you're an interested member of the public and you're monitoring a SEQRA review process. This is, I provided a step-by-step kind of process to shows you how to arrive at a SEQRA determination. And finally, we talked about how to review an environmental impact statement. And so moving on to today's topics, the role of the courts in the SEQRA review process. The first and most important role is its job is to evaluate whether somebody has standing. And standing kind of refers to somebody's right to file a, Article 78, which is also a legal challenge against a decision made by a lead agency. And it's important to note two things. One is that there's a time period in which you can file a legal challenge. It's usually 4 months after the date of the final decision made by the reviewing body. And the individual filing the legal challenge must prove that they are financially injured or injured otherwise from the decision made by the lead agency. So if you live 100 miles away from a project in a separate town and you just don't like how it went, chances are you won't have standing to sue. The second part is to establish thresholds. The courts have kind of established thresholds for how strictly SEQRA must be complied with, what kind of an environmental impact would trigger the necessity of an environmental impact statement to be prepared, and kind of what type of comments are valid enough for a lead agency to consider in a SEQRA review process. So they established some very key thresholds and ground rules for the interpretation of SEQRA, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. And finally, their job is to interpret the SEQRA statute and its implementing regulations. Most likely they will read what the regulations say, and through reviewing previous case law or other relevant legal decisions in the NEPA space, they'll decide kind of what the regulations mean as they were written. And ultimately, in the role of the public, their main role is to utilize SEQRA as a planning tool to improve their community. Most municipalities in New York State do not have full-time planning staff. However, they do have volunteer-led planning boards and or zoning boards of appeal, and they sit in a room faced with a project, and their job is to decide whether the project would fit in with their community, whether it would have any significant environmental impact, and how it would affect the town economically. And these is usually like 6 or 7 people in a room trying to make a decision. The public's role is to kind of inject intellectual capital into that decision-making process. Their job is to participate in these review processes and make their voices heard. Sometimes it's better to have 100 minds trying to solve a problem as opposed to just one body of 7 who've worked together for years. Finally, the role of the public is to utilize SEQRA to balance economic growth and environmental protection. SEQRA considers the environment broadly as both the built environment, so think about your buildings, your roads, your parks, your streetscape, your building facades, and then also kind of with the protection of your land, water, air, forest, and animal resources. So all of those together are kind of what constitute the environment. However, sometimes your built environment and natural environment may have competing priorities. You may want to build over a wetland, for instance. Well, SEQRA's job is to kind of make sure that that doesn't occur without thorough consideration of its environmental impacts. And then the public, lastly, their main, one of their key roles is to act as the first line of defense when the provisions of SEQRA are not complied with. Usually the state will say, they'll trust the planning boards or the local agencies to conduct the SEQRA review thoroughly and accurately. But in some cases, it isn't. And there could be problems with an application. There could be problems with the review process. There could be key environmental issues associated with an application that aren't appropriately considered. And in these cases, the public has to play the role of enforcer, in that they have to challenge the agency that made the decision via a civil practice laws and rules Article 78 proceeding. And they have to use that challenge to kind of point out a problem with the SEQRA review process and rely on the courts to decide if that problem is valid and if any corrections need to be made. And so I kind of wanted to kind of go, rather than just go over court cases and expect you to kind of understand kind of what they mean, I wanted to talk, use this moment to talk about a foundational concept of SEQRA. And so the first concept that I wanted to touch on was that SEQRA requires literal compliance as per New York State Environmental Conservation Law, Section 8-0103, Part 6. And the second concept is no agency may undertake, fund, or approve an action until the provisions of SEQRA have been complied with. And so these 2 points kind of lead into our first case, in which there's an entity that says, well, gee, we did a lot of a thorough environmental review, but we didn't fully comply with SEQRA. Is that okay? And so we're going to touch on that case next. And it's important to keep these 2 points in mind while I'm going over the case. So the case is the Town Association versus the Town of Rye. It's from 1981, so you'll notice that's 39 years ago, but still, it's still cited in legal cases today. So in this case, the Town of Rye, which is located in Westchester County, established a planned unit development, which is basically a parcel of land in which they say, we're gonna, thoroughly develop this parcel into something. And an applicant requests to build an office building on about 17.8 acres of land on the planned unit development site. However, this review took place prior to the SEQRA regulations being implemented. And so they did a pretty thorough environmental review on the planned unit development. And once SEQRA was enacted, they said, okay, we'll approve the project and we don't have to issue an environmental impact statement because we already studied the environmental issues associated with this project pretty thoroughly. A group of adjoining neighbors from a condo complex say, hold on a second, you have to comply with SEQRA, and they sue via an Article 78 proceeding. And so the issue is here that we talked about is substantial compliance with SEQRA enough for a project to get approved? And so in this case, the appellate division of New York State courts, they reviewed the record and said, while the applicant, the planning board did do a pretty thorough job with the review of environmental issues associated with the office complex and with the plan unit development. The SEQRA regulations and statute in New York State environmental conservation law say that the provisions of SEQRA must be complied with to the greatest extent possible. And so this means that you can't just say we did something else and we kind of complied with SEQRA. The courts interpreted that portion of the statute to mean that you must follow SEQRA's regulations to a T. And so it ended up being the case that the appellate division orders the planning board to prepare an environmental impact statement. And so, the importance of this ruling was that it really limits wiggle room during SEQRA review processes. It makes it so that, if there's a planning board or a town board or any sort of lead agency conducting a SEQRA review process, they must follow the regulations to a letter. So, the Part 617 regulations are online, and most planning boards, do their best to follow it, but the courts have held that they must follow it perfectly and accurately, no room for interpretation, and so that carries a lot of weight. And it's important, to note that in future years, like for instance, in 2011, there was a court case in which right towards the end of a SEQRA review process, a zoning board of appeals, I believe, downstate, they missed one procedural step related to SEQRA. And the public pointed that out. And due to the literal compliance revision, the zoning board of appeals had to redo their SEQRA analysis. And so that kind of goes to show you that, this ruling carried a lot of weight. And so the next point that I wanted to talk about is, it's been kicked around in the environmental space that a lead agency must take a hard look at the environmental impacts of an action. And so a hard look, that doesn't necessarily it means different things to different people. To some people, it could say, well, gee, we read everything that the applicant gave us. We did a little bit of research, and then we did our best to figure out what the environmental impacts of an action are. That's the courts have held that is not often adequate. And SEQRA review processes are not simply a check in the box exercise. Rather, it's a process that requires thorough empirical analysis and real thought. And so this case was kind of effectuated through a neighborhood coalition versus known as HOMES versus the New York State Urban Development Corporation. And in this case, the New York State Urban Development Corporation wanted to build a domed sports stadium for Syracuse University. I think they had an older stadium that was kind of getting run down, and they wanted to build a new domed stadium. And they thought it would bring in a lot of revenue from ticket sales, so on and so forth. The Syracuse Planning Commission designated the New York State Urban Development Corporation as lead agency. And so while the project was located in the city of Syracuse, because the project, was being financed and kind of overseen by the New York State Urban Development Corporation, they were designated as a lead agency in this case. The Urban Development Corporation kind of reviewed the application package, and they eventually issued a negative declaration. And a group of landowners, again, they say, hold on a second, you did not comply with the provisions of SEQRA, and they challenged via an Article 78 proceeding. And so the issue here was that the landowners made their Urban Development Corporation thoroughly aware of the fact that there would be extreme traffic and public safety impacts associated with the proposed project. However, the Urban Development Corporation, while they were aware that that was an issue, they did not think that it rose to the level of significance necessary to require the developer to prepare an environmental impact statement. And so the result is the appellate division of the New York State courts found that the Urban Development Corporation acted arbitrarily and capriciously in their review. So this term kind of means that the Urban Development Corporation knowingly omitted the fact that there was serious traffic and public safety concerns from their decision-making process, and that the record thoroughly shows that they knew that they did that. And so that was, a serious issue. If there was an environmental impact, that was clearly delineated based on thorough empirical analysis, and then the lead agency ignores that, the court said, look, that's not okay. And so the case ended up, proceeding to the point where the SEQRA review was paused and the Urban Development Corporation was allowed to correct its mistake. And they eventually did, and the project, I think, went through. And the importance of this case is basically the courts established a three-pronged test for taking a hard look at projects, the environmental impacts of a proposed project. And so the first prong is that the lead agency must identify all relevant areas of environmental concern. And so this means that if there is a project that could affect wildlife resources, air, water, neighborhood, character, traffic, so on and so forth, the lead agency must gather enough information to understand the scope of the impact, its magnitude, its duration, whether or not the impact could be mitigated, and they must kind of have a public record. So these are studies, papers, comments, reports that document that they took a look at that. The next thing is that they need to take a hard look at the potential environmental impacts of the project. This means that they must use peer-reviewed or fact public professional reports or thorough empirical analysis conducted by a citizen group or their hired consultants. They must thoroughly examine, using empirical evidence, the potential environmental impacts of a proposed project. And then once they've done that, they have to issue a decision which contains a well-reasoned elaboration. So the best way to think of this term is, if you've done math homework and you see the problem and you just write the answer and your teacher says, show your work, the well-reasoned elaboration is basically a request from the courts that the lead agency shows their work. So they must state in clear, concise, language what they looked at, what studies, what peer-reviewed papers, what professional reports they examined, whether or not those reports evidenced a significant environmental impact or not, and then how they made their ultimate decision in the environmental review process. So this kind of hard look requirement has permeated into many, many cases locally, and also all throughout the state even today, even though the case itself is, again, quite old, over 40 years old, actually. And so the foundational point number 3 is that, SEQRA reviews are triggered for an action that may be occurring now, but the regulations themselves require that future plans to develop on the same site are considered at the same time as the initial one. And this kind of problem kind of arises, because development doesn't always occur all at once. Sometimes you only have enough money to build 4 apartment units, even though your eventual plan is to expand to 45. And each time you submit a successive application for 4 apartment units, the environmental impact may not be as grave as seeing an application to construct 45 at once. And so this kind of piecemeal approach is called segmentation. And the regulations clearly state that segmentation is contrary to the purpose of SEQRA. So this is a kind of an important thing to realize, that if you see like the development of an industrial park and you see a site plan application for one office building, then another, then another, then another, you may not think that individually the environmental impacts would be severe. However, taken as a whole, the environmental impacts, would be serious, and they would have to, or may most likely require the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And so this is kind of a really, really, really important point to remember. So if there's a project in your town or your city that has multiple steps, it's important that all the steps are considered at once. And the following case kind of outlines that and outlines the why as to why that is. And so the case in this case was basically took place in Saratoga County in the town of Moreau. their zoning board of appeals issued a special permit for an application to build a 4-unit apartment building on a 31-acre parcel. And initially, the neighboring landowners didn't want it. They said, I don't want development occurring near me, and they filed an Article 78 proceeding in the lower courts in New York State. But the zoning board of appeals ruling is upheld. The zoning board of appeals in this case did a pretty thorough environmental analysis of how this kind of project could affect the environment, how it would affect the community, and the courts didn't see anything wrong the first time. Then the applicant, a little bit later, the applicant seeks to build another 4-unit apartment building on the same parcel. And in this case, the neighbors sue again. They say, because they said, you already got one, past us, we're not gonna let you get a second one past us. And they felt that they had grounds to sue. And so in this case, the question is it okay for an applicant to submit successive applications for the same parcel? So broken down into simple English, it's basically say once you've gotten one approval and you want to build kind of the same thing on the same site again, is it okay to submit a brand new application? And what the courts decided is that the applicant is responsible for providing information describing the whole action, which means all of their plans develop on the site, including future plans as well. And so they can't just submit, 4-unit apartment building proposal by 4-unit apartment building proposal, because once you get to like 10 of those approvals, you now have 40 units. And that's a lot different from having 4. And so the court said that piecemeal reviews are unacceptable, and they annulled the Zoning Board of Appeals decision. And so the importance of this is that, it requires members of the public and members of planning commissions and city councilors and town board members to really kind of watch sites where multiple developments could occur. And, unfortunately, this occurs over a period of years, maybe 4 years, maybe 10 years. But sometimes a developer will kind of build, projects gradually. And it's important at the very beginning to say, what is your grand plan? What do you want to do 10 years down the road, or if you had everything in the world and you fully developed the site? And this question is important to ask because the SEQRA regulations require it. And so they say, well, we're thinking about doing, maybe building another 10,000 square foot office building on a site where they already have, a 50,000 square foot office building. It's important that you consider those two buildings together and rather than individually. And so the foundational point number 4, a lot of times, in my career as a planner, I've heard questions from members of the public as to kind of what, would require, the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And, and then what is a positive declaration more broadly? So they'll ask kind of those two questions. And the answer is, if there, an environmental impact statement must be prepared if there is the possibility of a significant adverse environmental impact occurring as a result of a proposed project. And so this doesn't mean, that there's a 100% likelihood of an environmental issue or negative environmental impact occurring as a result of a proposed project. It's just the possibility of one occurring. And so this is known as the low threshold under SEQRA. And so it's established in the following case. In 1984, the town of North Salem, which is in Westchester County, issued a negative declaration for a proposed office/commercial development on a 4.23 acre commercially zoned parcel. And in this case, the planning board, and the reviewed numerous environmental concerns. They had a consultant help them. They took a pretty hard look at the potential environmental impacts associated with the development of that site, and they issued a negative declaration. So the petitioners sued via an Article 78 proceeding, a group of neighboring landowners, again in this case, being that the public is the first line of defense in SEQRA review processes. The lower court decides that, to uphold the planning board's decision because, they thought that the planning board did a pretty thorough job reviewing the environmental impacts of this commercial / office development. The petitioners appealed to a higher court, And then, the issue here is that the petitioners believe that there was a possibility that groundwater quality could be adversely impacted by the waste disposal system associated with the office/commercial development. In this case, their waste disposal system was located near a river, and the petitioner's engineer thought that the groundwater table was situated as such to where waste from the office building could go into the water table of the river and adversely affect drinking water quality. And so the appeals court said, look, even though you guys did look at a lot of environmental issues associated with the proposed project, you did not consider the possibility that groundwater quality could be adversely impacted. And so they ruled that the possibility of an adverse environmental impact occurring requires the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And so the importance of this ruling was that it solidifies the RAI decision requiring literal compliance with SEQRA, because in the previous slide we see that the threshold for preparing an environmental impact statement, and in this case the court says, look, if there's a likelihood of an environmental impact occurring, if it's proven with empirical evidence that it's possible, you have to prepare an environmental impact statement. And future court decisions have ruled that it only takes one of these issues to require the preparation of an environmental impact statement. And that's really kind of important to remember going forward. And so the fifth foundational point that I kind of would like to talk about is that, a lot of people who have full-time jobs and they're concerned about a controversial project and they want to write a comment letter, and they write one and they say, gee, why did the planning board or why did the city council not consider my comment? And this is because generalized objections to proposed projects are not grounds for denying it. This means, unfortunately, for the public, that you have to have that clear empirical evidence, just like the lead agency is required to use, that demonstrates whether a project has a significant negative environmental impact or not. And so, kind of this point leads to, kind of an arms race in which the applicant and the members of the public and other interested agencies have to gather, prepare, and submit factual evidence to help the lead agency make a thorough decision. And so, unfortunately, applicants will have, expensive consultants, as will the lead agency, and then the public, a lot of the times, is forced to put in money to hire a consultant to help them comment on the proposed project. This is just the way it is, and the following case kind of explains a little bit more of that concept. And so in this case, it's a WEOK Broadcasting Corporation versus the town of Lloyd in the early 90s. And the town of Lloyd is located in Ulster County, so kind of upstate, just near the city of Kingston. And so in this case, the applicants sought to construct an AM radio transmission tower in the town of Lloyd. And in this case, the transmission tower was tall enough to where it would be visible from the Franklin D. Roosevelt estate. And due to the historical significance of the estate, the planning board required the applicant to prepare a draft environmental impact statement. And so the applicant prepares a really, really thorough environmental impact statement. They analyze visual impacts from multiple angles. They have a very clear methodology that they use that's well established in the national space. They, thoroughly reviewed public comments. They made sure that their environmental impact statement took, every relevant issue of environmental concern into account. And then they submitted it to the planning board for them to accept. And the planning board ultimately decides to deny the site plan application, citing the unavoidable environmental impacts associated with kind of the, the visual impacts that the tower would kind of perpetrate on the surrounding area. And they kind of brought up the Franklin D. Roosevelt estate as a prime example. And so the applicant in this case, they felt aggrieved that the planning board unfairly denied their site plan application. So they issued an Article 78 proceeding. And so in the issue, their issue was that, they felt that they did a thorough environmental analysis. And kind of their question was like, what do we have to do to get our site plan approval kind of, issued? And so in this case, the burden of proof was on the planning board. Their job, as stated by the New York State Supreme Court, was that their job was to provide substantial evidence backed up with empirical analysis and data to the same, quality or near the same quality as the applicant's analysis. And they had to kind of demonstrate that their empirical analysis provided them enough evidence or enough ammunition to kind of back up their site plan denial. And in this case, the Supreme Court found that the record in that regard was lacking. They said that the planning board failed to provide substantial evidence backing up their claims, especially, and this was especially egregious considering the fact that the applicant provided information proving to the contrary. And so, and in this case, the denial was annulled and they had to go back and redo the site plan review process and SEQRA process. And so the importance of this case is that it places a high standard of proof on commenters during a SEQRA review process. So if you are, neighboring landowner and you're unhappy about how a development project is going, you can't just say, I don't like it, and expect the planning board to deny it. You have to work with somebody or get help from somebody or prepare yourself a detailed comment letter describing in empirical terms why the development project is bad, why you feel like it would injure you financially, mentally, or otherwise, and why you feel, what kind of mitigation measures you feel would be necessary to address that. And so that's kind of, unfortunately, that places a really high standard of our high burden of proof on the public. But in order to provide a sense of equity to the lead agency and the applicant, the courts have held that that is those are the rules of the road, so to speak. And so OCCA, so now we're kind of done with the kind of court, foundational court cases. And so we can take this time for you to ask any questions. If not, we'll kind of launch into the next segment of our presentation. Any questions, anybody? Okay, hearing none. So OCCA is offering a series of online planning classes that can be accessed anytime. If you are a member of a planning board or zoning board of appeals, you can receive continuing education credits associated by attending our training. And if you need a certificate demonstrating that you went to this webinar, you can email me at planner@occainfo.org. And so you can sign up for the planning classes. And if you're interested, reach out to me anytime. And so what's included, the two-part training that we just kind of went through was a very, very brief overview of the SEQRA review process. Naturally, it's far more complex. There's far more to it than what I've included in this webinar. And so I've broken it out into 4 courses. The first being how to understand the environmental assessment form. The second for members of the public or interested agencies on how to prepare strong comments. The third course dives deep into the environmental impact statement. We talk about the procedure associated with the review of environmental impact statements, in addition to the level of detail that those documents must require. And then we go a lot farther into more notable court decisions in the 4th course. And so those will be, for interested members, we'll have those courses uploaded to our website relatively quickly. And yeah, we hope that you take part in that. And we feel that, again, the public being the first line of defense, it's important to have as many SEQRA champions as we can get. And so more basically, we have a circuit writer planner program. I will assist communities with SEQRA reviews, with the development of comprehensive plans on zoning related issues and other environmental planning initiatives, such as watershed planning or climate action planning or energy planning. Our organization offers a wide array of services in that regard. Currently, we offer a 50-50 cost share should a municipality be interested in retaining us. We charge $50 per hour. Our normal rate is 100. And so the organization kind of eats that cost to provide an essential service to municipalities that may have budget constraints or may simply need planning assistance and they just don't have the resources to acquire it. And so we also offer a variety of other trainings, such as how to develop agricultural and farmland protection plans, how to develop comprehensive plans. We offer an overview of zoning. And in certain cases, as requested, we can take a SEQRA review process that was done by a specific town and do a deep dive into it and describe what went right, what went wrong, and what could be improved upon. And so those specific town-specific trainings are available, but you do need to contact me for getting access to them. And so if there's any questions, here's my contact information. You can call or email me anytime. You'll notice that the phone number on the left is our office number, and due to the coronavirus, the number is no longer, our office is closed. And so that number on the right is my cell phone number, which I can be reached at as long as we're working from home. And my email is attached to my phone, so I should be able to respond to most inquiries within 24 hours. So with that said, I thank you all for taking the time to attend this webinar, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.